Mini-Hoon on the Kaka to John Clarke, who is the Executive General Manager at Transpower for the Future Grid Initiative. John, lovely to have you on again.
Yes, kia ora, Bernard. It's good to be talking with you again too.
Tell us about what Transpower is, asking people and why it's asking them these things.
We're really interested in what people think New Zealand will be doing looking out to 2050. How will we be? What will our economy be doing? How will we grow and thrive? We know as a nation we have some headwinds. We're an aging population. We don't really have enough money to fund all the infrastructure we'd like to have. There's a range of challenges like that we have, and I guess from our perspective as owners and operators of the electricity transmission grid, if New Zealand is to be successful and to grow, we don't want to be the people that are the blockers because we weren't insightful enough to establish that we needed to do more than we're doing today. And we know that our infrastructure, not unlike other infrastructure, can take 5 to 10 years to get in place if you're doing more than just upgrading what you already have. So
yeah, so those are interesting sort of questions to begin the discussion. You've got also a very interesting online survey which I've taken and which I'll include a link to in the show notes with this podcast, which essentially asks the obvious, the sort of basic assumptions that we should base our thinking on, including whether we'll be net zero in terms of emissions by 2050, and also whether we want a growing and thriving economy, because there'll be a few people actually who either want us to pull out of Paris and ignore all that stuff and are have some novel and minority views on the science. And then there's a bunch of people who say, well, actually, we should be degrowthing. We shouldn't be growing. So what made you think about those two basic assumptions as things to focus on?
Back in 2017, 2018, we had a look at the opportunity for decarbonisation. There was a lot of conversations about the fact that we do and still do need to address or reduce the causes of climate change. And at that point, given various settings at the time, we looked at it and said, hey, electricity demand could grow by 70% to 2050 if light transport and heavy industry was decarbonised. As it's turned out in the intervening 7 years, those predictions are probably on the low side. Especially if you think about things like data centres have become big conversations. We may need to develop our own sustainable fuels here if we want to fly our key export products like even strawberries and roses overnight to Europe. So we want those things to continue. We could end up having to have a lot more electricity use in order to make that happen. In thinking about 2050, when this sort of exercise has been run in some other countries, there are clear government policy settings. For instance, Australia aspires to be 80% renewable electricity by 2030. We don't have that. So to frame what we may have to do, we've chosen net zero by 2050 as a clear goal to do that, and a focus on developing some scenarios, one that looks like we carry on the path we're on, and others that entertain different futures where we do grow. So some of those futures may be that we are into producing green services such as your data centres. Others may be a continuation of our current farming, forestry, fibre exports, that they're still happening, but that we're using more electricity to process those things than we do today. There are other scenarios we have in mind as well. So just different futures for New Zealand. We're really interested in those because the electricity network is like that. It's actually a network, a spider web, and where they locate will tell us what might need to happen to the shape of our network. If particular regions grow and thrive a lot, because that's the type of future we adopt, that could be quite different. One that I find quite interesting is, there's a lot of talk in Southland of data centres, whether Tiwai would actually perhaps produce more aluminium because it's renewable or not. Today Southland uses over 12% of our electricity for aluminium smelting and other things. You can easily hypothesize that some of the developments they're talking about, South will be using way over 30% of the electricity we're using today. And then from a grid perspective, it's no longer all about electrons flowing north. It's actually electrons flowing south. So we're really interested in those different futures because they'll tell us different things about what our network might need to do to help be an enabler.
There was a period 20 or 30 years ago when a lot of people thought the future was going to be distributed, and therefore we didn't need to spend a lot of money putting up towers and having big lines and putting cables across the Cook Strait and all of that sort of thing. Somehow the electricity would be generated close to the consumer, and we wouldn't need to be having all these electrons going all this distance. And that turned out to be quite convenient for the owners of the network who didn't really want to or didn't think they could afford to invest in it. Eventually, the future caught up with everyone, and it hadn't gone distributed, and so there was a sort of a mad scramble to invest and rebuild and build out the networks, which we've sort of largely gone through, or we're just sort of finishing off, and that's being funded. And for some people, they will see that in their bills. Um, but maybe this time is different. Maybe with the growth of solar and in particular the falling costs of batteries, maybe it could be distributed. Is that something that you're going to have to think about or are looking for a view on?
Well, you've got a really good recall of the journey from 20, 30 years ago. And I have to say, I first joined the industry at a time, even within our company, there was something known as the glide path. And yes, small gas-fired fuel cells under everyone's kitchen sink would mean that there was no need for the grid. And you are also right in Transpower's case in the late 2000s, we invested $4 billion catching up, making sure there was a reliable supply into Auckland and into other regions, and that our DC link was upgraded. Um, you also, it's also very valid that we don't want to um, overbuild any of the core network infrastructure. So there's really a role, and you and I talked about this earlier in 2024, to find ways to better optimize what we do need to build. So if um, using what they call flexibility amongst consumers and the distribution networks, a more decentralized grid, does offer the prospect that when you do need to build transmission or remote power stations to supply the load, you can size what you want much more appropriately. So you're trying to make the transition more affordable. Whether it can all be done just with rooftop solar and batteries, I'm not so sure. And one of the things we'll do in this work is we'll be evidence based, right? So, if we find that we do need to build grid at scale, we want to be able to talk to the Commerce Commission, to the likes of the people involved in consenting in that. So, we want to provide the evidence that the right combination of a decentralized grid relying on distributed resources and some central generation, especially for those really big electrical loads. If we are getting into data centers, if we are going to have sustainable fuels, even electrifying a big dairy factory, which we're working on Frontier at the moment, is going to be more than just rooftop solar needed to make that happen. So we're trying to find the and here. How does a decentralized system work together with still having a core network that has centralized geothermal, um, you know, rooftop solar and wind together in order to meet our needs of the future. So it's sort of the way we see it at the moment is and, but one of the things we want to prove And one of the things we'll seek input on in the further stages of our grid blueprint Tikanapu work is what people think about the sort of scenarios we build about how electricity is being generated and how much of it can come from within the networks themselves. One of the big pluses for consumers around obviously solar panels and batteries is it will make smaller communities and that a bit more resilient when there are interruptions. But we're not so sure it's that helpful when you've got big industries and big cities to power.
Yeah, because there is an idea that you could use wind and solar and grid scale batteries and grid scale solar close to consumers, which are vulnerable to shady, quiet days. But then effectively use the big baseload that we've still got, the big dams, um, to essentially sort of top everyone up and tide us over on those quiet and shady days. But you'd obviously need a network to do that on the occasion when it was quiet and shady in Auckland, and you needed to pump the power from the South Island up, because no one's really expecting that there's going to be a whole bunch of new big baseload that gets done. It's just going to take too long and be too costly, and the consenting makes everyone's heads hurt. So what are the prospects then that we could see more of that, where the baseload we've already got effectively becomes the backstop rather than the generator of most of the electricity?
That that is a very real future for us. In the short term, obviously, with the situation where our gas reserves aren't as great as they are, in order to get through the cold winter nights and the occasional dry winters with our hydro lakes, which do happen, we have to rely on Huntly burning coal. I know that's not very palatable, and we do have to find a way as part of our future to reduce that dependence. And we're probably always going to need to think about some form of backup, even though hydro is really useful and really flexible. Um, you are always going to have dry years. In our earlier forecasts out to 2050, we built out a generation future where hydro was still, it's currently about 60% of the mix, it was still 35% of the mix. So you've still got that vulnerability. So sort of a question for our industry, which will help shape the grid, is where is that long duration storage reserve going to be? Project Onslow was an expensive solution to that problem. Um, it's good to see the industry in the short term is backing ways to keep Huntley on coal, so that people can be confident in their electricity supplies as we go into the future. Um, to your point, yes, we can have solar and even wind within local networks to make them more resilient, but we do have to cover the times when they are not like that. One area that we shouldn't rule out is geothermal. Geothermal's been a quiet success story. It started off as 5% of our generation mix quite a few years ago, got quite a boost up to 10 to 11% around 2010, 2011, where there was a bit of expansion in the largely Taupo area. And more recently, you wouldn't believe it's now 20% of our generation mix. And it's there all the time as baseload. Again, it's only largely located in the volcanic Taupo volcanic zone, so you need a grid to be able to distribute it. But you know, albeit it's can be somewhat expensive to get, it's a great asset, and once you've got it, it's a key part of your power system.
Although we could always just build all of our new cities near that lake. It's quite a nice place. Uh,
We
um,
do, we do that. We
yeah,
could
that's
indeed.
that's one form of
We'll
demand.
build industries there. So
Yeah, yeah.
yes,
Well,
yes.
some of them are shutting down, but anyway, let's just look at the demand side. I mean, it's only natural for Transpower to think about the business of transmitting electricity and the grid needs. And you can't ignore the supply side of the equation when you do that. But there is a demand side, and there are a bunch of people who think we haven't been very good at at the demand side, particularly in home and using market signals or any signals really to adjust things from the demand side. How interested are you in the sort of demand side solutions or proposals to help solve the problem?
Well, we're really keen that we do develop the right market settings to enable either consumers themselves or agents for those consumers, aggregators, to be able to best harness, if people have got solar on their roofs, grid scale batteries, if even communities form together to form their own little microgrids, which they may do, it's happened overseas, that they are appropriately rewarded in terms of what they can contribute to the electricity market. As I said earlier, that helps us and also the distribution companies right size our pipes, and that's good for New Zealand overall. So we are very interested. And going back to our early 2024 conversation, when we do build or propose to largely upgrade the grid, that's what we're doing at the moment, we do have an option where we can go out and ask, are there alternatives that can either replace this need or delay it, right? So we have something called non-transmission solutions. So it sounds horribly technical, but we have been working with the Commerce Commission to make them more accessible when we think, as we currently are in the Western Bay of Plenty, the Western Bay of Plenty is looking at I think, a 50% increase in electricity demand out to 2030, potentially up to over 100% by 2050. There are, we're fortunate that people built grid into those regions that can be upgraded without having to build new lines. But even then, we want to say, well, before we do this, are there alternatives that can delay when we need to do it? So the impact on bills doesn't come as quick as it might, and we don't build capacity that's likely utilised for the first 2 years. So that's a framework that we're working on as part of enabling the right size investment. I think just would be interest. What's on our mind here too is we can upgrade the existing grid. We currently have $2 to $3 billion of projects in our pipeline, which we will work to get approved between now and 2030 to do a whole range of things, including replacing the Cook Strait cables and getting more capacity into the Upper South Island and Western Bay of Plenty progressively into Auckland. Where the grid blueprint and Te Kanapu is going is there may come a time when you've run out of those easy options, right? And we are still upgrading the lines through the centre of the North Island, the Desert Road lines. They were upgraded when I was in Transpower in the 2000s. Now they're getting another birthday. But if our economy is more dependent on electricity, how acceptable is to have the main connection between the top of the North and the bottom of the North Island running past two volcanoes? Right, so we need to think about resilience as well. So that's on our minds. How do you not only add to a network when you have to, but do it in a way that you've got more options to supply if things go wrong?
Yeah, just finally, this is the start of a process. So, what can people expect who maybe filled in the online survey or committed to? What should they expect is coming up in the next few months?
Sure. Um, so we are on a roughly 18 months journey to develop our good blueprint. We've just gone out and asked people what do they think should be driving the scenarios we think of, and that closes this week. Although happy for people to keep filling it in over the next few days or the weekend, we'll definitely receive anything comes in late. Um, then the next will be forming our scenarios. So we'll have scenarios and we'll be interested in what people think about that. It's probably getting a little bit closer to the area that of more of the sort of knowledgeable and expert people, but we'll still find a way, I think, of reaching and drawing interest from businesses, from communities, from individuals, because we really do need your input. Again, as I said earlier, they're not hard things we must achieve in New Zealand. There's just that net 2050. So we're interested in building scenarios that reflect what New Zealand want. Then later that'll be later in September. Then towards the end of the year, our scenarios will be pretty well formed, and we'll also be sharing how we think the generation mix might be across our different scenarios, again, for people's input. Then the hard analytics happen in early 2026. The number crunching, use of slide rules will be far more complex than slide rules, I assure you. And we'll come up with an initial draft grid blueprint around the middle of 2026. We'll talk to people about what we've found. One of the things we'll be interested in, because we're looking out to 2050, and we're looking, say, across 3 or 4 or 5 futures, is what's actually common to all of them, say, in the 2030s, right? Because that will also give us a flag. Hey, we can carry on incrementally upgrading what we want, or oops, if we really want to be an enabler, we've got some bigger things to do. We better start having some conversations with people about how to make those happen. And then at the end of 2026, we'll have our grid blueprint work. I fully expect, because of this is the first time we've done this, we'll end up raising more questions, and probably 2-3 years afterwards, we'll be doing the exercise again. This is first grid blueprint will have set the direction, if you like, and we'll take a step in that direction. We'll then run the process, as I say, sometime 3, 4, 5 years time, and that will affirm or change our direction. And it's a good way of making sure you do things in a affordable, low regrets way. So it won't be a case of the grid blueprint being the absolute mandate for all time. It will set our direction and allow us to then revisit and adjust our direction as the unknowns in our scenarios eventuate.
John Clarke, the Executive General Manager for the Future Grid Initiative at Transpower. Thank you very much for being on a Mini-Hoon on the Kaka.
Thank you, Bernard.